Well, good to be with you again. Book of Mark, chapter 9, you can turn there if you've got a Bible in front of you, or if you need it from the pew beneath you, there's a Bible. So if you show up at church and you're like, I don't have a Bible with me, you can always grab one underneath the pew. So Mark chapter 9, now we are going to go just a few verses this morning. And part of the reason is because, boy, these verses are packed. They're important. It's to hear them and let it sink in. Also, I want to encourage you, if you have questions about the faith, questions about the sermon, just about who Jesus is, how to follow him, please feel free to send those questions in to the address on the screen. I'll take 5 to 7 minutes to answer them anonymously. Won't tell anybody who sent it in. But please feel free to do that. Well, let's start this morning with a simple question, and it really gets to the heart of modern life, okay? Simple question. The question is this: do you want to hear the good news or the bad news first? How many of you are bad news first people, by the way? I'm a bad news first person. I don't trust the good news until I've heard the bad news. You know what I mean? That's how I am. Some of you are like, tell me the good news first. I'm not ready for the bad news. But look, I imagine that most of us want to hear the bad news eventually. We want to get there eventually. But we're experts at delaying the bad news, or buffering ourselves against the bad news, or making it seem less bad than it is, finding the bright side of things. And the thing is, the worse the news gets in our world, the more likely we are to disappear into virtual good worlds, you know? We go online, or we stream ourselves to death with all kinds of entertainment, whatever it is. Or we just live really busy, manicured lives, full of good things, things to distract, things to make our lives seem better than they are. And here's the thing, it doesn't actually just happen in everyday life. It happens in the life of the church. It happens among religious people. That sometimes we kind of smooth away the rough edges of what's really going on in our hearts so that it doesn't snag on the spiritual lives that we've constructed. We try to be as good as possible while keeping the bad news to a minimum. Well, this isn't new. What we're going to learn is the disciples in Jesus' day struggled with the bad news too. They struggled to hear it. They struggled not to run away from it, struggled to understand it. This is the second of 3 consecutive times that Jesus is going to predict his death. He does so in Mark chapter 8, 9, and 10. But the first time he does it, he talks about the scribes and the Pharisees. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious ones, are going to be the ones that put me to death. And, you know, that's a little bit easier to take. The religious ones are going to do this. And you can say, well, I'm not like those people. But then in chapter 9, Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to fall into the hands of men. And now it becomes more personal. Because what he's pressing on, and what I want us to think about this morning, what he's pressing on, is the bad news that each and every one of us, as human beings, are culpable. We are responsible. We are guilty. And we have to do something about that. What Jesus is doing is he lays this out to the disciples is essentially to say, look, if you refuse to hear the bad news, if you're unwilling to understand it, if you're unwilling to let it penetrate the heart, then you will be too confused and too fearful to hear the good news. If you're unwilling to hear the bad news, if you're unwilling to embrace it. And listen, I recognize that's a hard thing. It is a hard thing in our world. Often, you know, if you talk to people like I do who would not call themselves Christians, but they're kind of religious, they want to kind of smooth over the bad news. Life's not that bad. The story's not that bad. I can make it okay. Well, this morning we're going to talk about that bad news as pretty much the worst thing you've ever heard. But we're also going to talk about the good news that is best and last. And when we've done both of those things, when we've looked at the worst of possible news, and we've looked at the best possible news, and how it's the last news, then what happens is you and I learn how to practice a new way of living. All right? There's a way of practicing that good news together. So let's take a look here. Mark chapter 9. It's fairly quick. Verse 30. Here's what God's word says. They went on from there, meaning, and if you remember, this is the casting out of the demon from the epileptic boy. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he didn't want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. So the disciples are traveling through Galilee, okay, just to set a little bit of the picture here. Galilee it was their safe zone. Galilee was their comfort place. Galilee is where they did all the miracles, right? Galilee it's fairly straightforward, and there are lots of ministry highlights there. But Jesus is particular in saying, look, I'm not going to do those things here. He doesn't want anyone to know. He wants to drive home a very important point with the disciples. And just so that you understand what's going on in the story of Mark as a whole, this is part of Jesus' turning toward Jerusalem. All right? So much of the Bible is telling us that God does not ignore or try to avoid this hard thing. As a matter of fact, he's turning toward it. All right? So Jesus recognizes the seriousness of the moment, and he wants to teach the disciples. More important, the kind of most important thing here, more important than anything else, than healing and proclaiming the gospel, more important than that, is Jesus' need to instruct the disciples about his upcoming death. This isn't working, by the way, so you'll have to follow through, sorry. He has to instruct them about his upcoming death and how human sin is involved. Now, it's important to note that that's central, okay? That is so important that Jesus says, even though it is beautiful and right that people would be healed, even though it's beautiful and right that people would hear the gospel proclaimed more broadly, Jesus is saying this is the most important thing, and I think that's instructive for us too. Listen, there are a lot of things that the church does. There are a lot of good works that the church does. The church is involved in caring for the poor. The church is involved in acts of mercy. The scriptures are very clear that we can't be just kind of hearers, but we must also be doers of the gospel. But here's the thing. As important as those things are, the proclamation of the atoning death and resurrection of Jesus Christ must be central. And the most important thing we do. We have to get that right. And so Jesus is showing us that that is the priority here. He does this by identifying his office. He says, Son of Man, I am the Son of Man. And if you're curious about that terminology, I remember hearing a lot of times growing up, well, because Jesus said he was Son of Man, he's saying he's not God, right? No, I'm just a Son of Man like any of you. Well, that's not what he's saying. What he was saying is, I'm occupying the office of humanity as God. So I'm putting on human flesh. I'm going into the world. And so Jesus says, while covered in human flesh, right? While covered in human flesh, I am going to be betrayed into the hands of men so that I can suffer and die. Jesus is making sure the disciples can connect his suffering to the brokenness of human beings. By virtue of his wearing our flesh, he's going to be betrayed. That idea of being delivered over and betrayed, those are very similar words in the Greek. This is not just bad news. This is their bad news. This is the disciples' bad news. They're human beings too. They're men. There's a short story written by Ursula Le Guin like 50 years ago. And she wrote this essay about a fictional place called Omelas. And in this place, it's beautiful, it's light, there's joy and art. Food is lovely, people are festive. It's a beautiful cosmopolitan world, okay? And what you learn is that the thriving of this city of Amalus is all resting on the suffering of one child. That one child locked away in a cellar is the energy, it's the way that the city thrives. And so everybody in the city, at a certain point in their lives, everyone in the city has to decide. They find out about the child. They go and they visit the child. They see the child. And they have to decide if they're going to stay. They have to decide if they're going to keep living here, knowing that their thriving is on this one child's suffering, right? So the story is called Those Who Walk Away from Amalus, and only some walk away. Many people stay. And their interaction with the child, they see the child suffering and they're inspired to be good to other people. Or they're ashamed of the child's suffering, so they're moved to be compassionate toward people. This is not unusual. It's, whether or not you could stand to live in Amalus, it's dependent upon whether you can keep a distance from the child's suffering. Some check out. Some find a way to thrive close enough to benefit while not being so close that they're bothered. This is not unusual for us. We are masters at benefiting, being just close enough to benefit, while not so close that we're bothered by the suffering of others, and that certainly extends to the story of who Jesus is and his death. Very comfortable with the idea that somewhere there was a distant moment of injustice and suffering, and it was such a great story that it changed my life. It's far less comfortable for us to say, it was me. And humanity is lost if it's left to its own devices, because we live in a world that believes that if we can just be good enough, we can make things okay. Jesus is very intent on saying, no, that's not the way that it works. In Jesus' greatest sermon, the sermon of the two sons, you recognize it as the prodigal. The younger son goes to the father and he says, give me my inheritance now. And that was very similar to going to him and saying, you're worth more to me dead than alive. This theme of God's people not wanting God, it's all over the place in the scriptures. John says, light came into the world, but the people preferred darkness more than light. So they rejected him. This is the story of the scriptures, that you and I, at heart, okay, this is how bleak it gets. What the scriptures teach is that at the heart of who we are, we would rather Jesus be thrown on a cross than to be crossed up by him in our everyday lives. We would rather have Jesus suffer than to have to live into the teaching that he gives us, which is that we are our own worst enemies. And we need to be saved. And we cannot save ourselves. So Jesus says, this is what you have to get. This is what you have to understand. There are lots of ways to think about salvation stories. If it's a guru that dies a noble death, a good teacher, whatever else, we are inspired by them. We can be encouraged by them. But if the one who dies because of us, if he dies wearing our flesh, our names, our stories, it's very intrusive. So we find a way to distance ourselves. How can I get close enough? How can I be at church? How can I do the things that will help me to thrive? How can I even adopt some of the tenets of Christian living while at the same time not being bothered by the story of the cross that tells me that my heart would have put him up there just like everybody else? How do I do that? Christianity, Jesus' point, the atonement doesn't save us from something, it saves us from us. It saves us from ourselves. Now, not everyone in the world is going to agree. Not everyone in the world is going to agree that they want to be saved from themselves. Not everyone's going to agree that that's the way to live. But listen, you cannot get to the good news in the gospel. You cannot make sense of Jesus until we're first willing to believe the bad news. And that's not unusual when you're reading through the scriptures, you see the story of Christ, but it's very unusual in the world of religious belief that you must believe in the God who dies first, and because of you first, before you can believe in the one who saves you. So sin has to be the worst news you've ever heard. It has to be the absolute worst. But it also has to be greater. There has to be greater news, bigger news that's better and best when compared to the bad news. And that's what we see at the end of verse 31. So I want you to notice something, right? Jesus mentions his death, and he often mentions his resurrection, like right next to it. And that's what he does here. Now, think about this language first. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men. In the Old Testament, David talks about this. From 2 Samuel 24, says, God's mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hand of men, right? That's like the awful thing that can happen. And then in Jesus' vineyard parable, I'm going to get to the resurrection in a second. Just hold on to this. In Jesus' vineyard parable, if you remember it, there are some tenants, right? And the servants come and they've rented this land from the landowner, and the servants come and they want to take the rent from the tenants, and the tenants kill all the servants. Then the story gets worse. Because then the landowner says, well, if I send my son, they'll respect him. And he sends his son, and it says he fell into the hands of them, right? And they kill him. In the end of the vineyard parable, justice comes raining down. An army comes and obliterates them, right? And as you're reading it, you're cheering on, you know? Jesus is giving this parable in front of the scribes and Pharisees. But when he's talking to his disciples, here's another picture of a son falling into the hands of men. It doesn't end with his vengeance. It ends with his resurrection. As he tells it here, he's not done. Here's another son delivered. Jesus could have said, look, what's going to happen next is I'm going to ascend to heaven. I'm going to rise from the grave. I'm going to zoom up, right? It's going to be a great pyrotechnics show. It's going to be the Northern Lights times 100. You're going to see this great moment. But Jesus doesn't skip the resurrection part. He doesn't skip showing up and being in our skin. That's the next thing that happens. He rises. He doesn't ascend immediately. He rises. So what does that tell us? Well, look, if you're a Buddhist, your goal is to escape the flesh. If you're a Muslim, your goal is to punish the flesh and purify it. If you're a Christian, your goal is that the flesh would rise with Jesus and be redeemed. And that's what happens. The old patristics, the old fathers of the faith, they had this expression. They said, what is not assumed is not redeemed. When Jesus assumes our flesh, that first part of this, when he dies at the hands of men, when he takes your and my face and name and he wears it to the cross and he goes into the grave, it's only part of the story, because the second part is he rises and he hasn't sloughed off us. He rises with us on him. Our flesh on his flesh. It's a very important teaching of Christian theology. The bodily resurrection of Christ is so critical that the Apostle Paul says, if it didn't happen, we should all be pitied. We should be pitied most. Because what happens is if the Son is raised wearing your and my flesh, then it tells us that it's possible that the flesh gets redeemed. That there's forgiveness, that there's transformation. A friend of mine, his name's Bob, pastor named Bob Crossland. He's a pastor in Silicon Valley. And he became a believer kind of like I did. And he tells this story. He said, my first year as a Christian, I was 16. I had no previous church experience, and I went to this little rural church in West St. Louis. Every time the Mississippi preacher would get around to the gospel, and it was usually the third point, I would just start chuckling. A joyful, muffled laughter would just well up and bubble over in me. Said it was pretty sweet. We're converted to faith in Christ in part to catch the punchline that follows sin, which is that sin doesn't have the last word. It doesn't have the last word. Frederick Buechner puts it this way. He says, the worst isn't the last thing about our world. It is the next to last thing. Listen, Christians tell that story more than anyone else. Suffering is only the next to last thing. The last thing is the best. It's the power from on high that comes down into the world, that wells up from the rock bottom worst of the world like a hidden spring. Can you believe it? The last best thing is the laughing deep in the hearts of the saints. Sometimes our hearts even, yes, you are terribly loved and forgiven. Yes, you are healed. All is well. The gospel is that the bad news gets swallowed up by the good news. In fact, all that the bad news can do is load the tension like a spring until the resurrection lets it fly. And the more bad news you have and the more tension added to that spring, the greater the force in the release when it happens. The story that Jesus tells us to say, there's nothing you can do that can keep me from redeeming this skin, this body. His resurrection was proof that the worst humanity could do was to load that spring where we would see God's incredible, steadfast love. It meant that every bit of betrayal that you and I bring, every bit of the nastiness of our heart that one day wants to follow Jesus and the next day wants to follow ourselves, every bit of that stuff that we lay upon Christ when we trust in Him, every bit of that is just force for the beautiful truth that God's love is steadfast and never failing. It loads the spring, every last bit of saying, God, can you love me if I am this? Can you redeem me? Can you redeem my flesh if it's flesh that has done A, B, C, and D? God, can you forgive me if I've done all these things? Now listen, there is no other God who is willing to sit there and say, give me your list and don't stop until you're done. But that's what we have here. Falls into the hands of men. Is put to death by men. 3 days later, He rises. Unbelievable, sinful hearts can only make the heart of God more believable. Christians have no fear to look into our own darkness, because we can give that to Jesus. The outcome of that, in many ways, when I talk to my own children, and I regularly tell them things like, listen, I know you're not perfect. I know there are things you don't tell me. I know you're more sinful. Because I don't want them to think that they can shock me, or that they can hide that, or that they need to hide that. I want to represent Jesus to them. I want to encourage them. There is nowhere you can run so fast where the grace of God cannot overtake you. There is no load you can lay on the resurrection that it cannot lift. We can embrace the bad news because the good news is the best in the last. The best in the last. So what does that do to us? Verse 32, I thought, is interesting, right? They did not understand the saying. They were afraid to ask Him. This is the outcome, pre-resurrection. The outcome pre-resurrection is, what in the world is going to happen now? You're going to die because of us? You're going to be raised? How does that work? You and I live on the other side of that. We've seen it. Jesus has been resurrected, so what does that do to us? When the depths of human sin are met by the power of the resurrection, Christian living and ethics and faithfulness, it rises up with the resurrection. In other words, the power for us to live as God's called us to live, it rises with Jesus. The disciples struggled. They were really close to Jesus. They'd been everywhere with him, but you know what? They hadn't seen the resurrection yet. They hadn't seen the death yet. They knew it in theory. More important than proximity, physical proximity to Jesus, is understanding of this message. What happens as a result? We who are in Christ, we have the rest of that story. So we don't have to pretend that things are okay when they aren't. We can look at the balance of these two things. If we see that the resurrection wins in the end, that the last word is the best word, if we can see that, then you and I don't have to balance the ledger in our lives. And here's practically how this looks. Something bad happens to you, and you don't have to immediately say, well, that bad thing happened so that this good thing can happen, therefore I can live with that, right? You don't have to say, well, if God's going to move me to this place and I'm going to be miserable there, then at least A, B, or C, or D are going to be true, and that's going to balance it out, and that's going to tell me that God loves me. That's how I'm going to be assured, because I can make it work. I can make it fit. But listen, there are people who die every day in abject poverty, squalor, war-torn lands, who are beaten, who are raped, pillaged, hurt, and yet they will be inheritors of the resurrection, and that is the only thing that can make things well. You and I are in the same place. What makes things right? What makes things right is that there is a hammer and there is an anvil. And the hammer is the death and the work of Jesus Christ in all things, and your and my work too. And the anvil is the resurrection. And unless we have the knowledge of that resurrection and recognize that all things will be made whole and new and healed, there is no way to do the work of God. So what does that mean? Friends, we're going to go to work this morning. Let me tell you what it means. You need to practice the resurrection, the supremacy of the resurrection. And the very best way to practice it is to observe the Sabbath. You may wonder how those two things are connected. There's a foundation and there's a function of the Sabbath. The foundation of the Sabbath was Genesis 1, and God rests. But the function of the Sabbath was so that we could see what the future is going to be like and live it now. Believe it or not, you're not just in church this morning because church is there. You're in church this morning to taste the resurrection right here. This is it. And by the way, before you wonder, okay, am I forever going to be sitting in a worship service? The answer to that is no. You're not forever going to be living in a worship service, but all of life will be the exaltation of God in the new heavens and the new earth, and all tears will be wiped away. Joy will reign supreme. And so as a foretaste of that, we structured this worship service so that you can taste it, so that you can observe it, so that you can enjoy it. So what does that mean? Well, it means you worship well. It means you meditate on God on the Sabbath. It means that you recreate. It means that you enjoy Him and you enjoy one another. It may mean that if your kids are grounded on a Sunday, that you suspend their grounding on Sunday. They might enjoy being together with family. Not suspend their grounding so they can go do whatever they want, but so that they can really enjoy the Sabbath to the fullest. And it also means that you have to suspend your own grounding too. And your desire, your need, your willingness to work at all times, at all hours, to work constantly on building yourself or building your children or making them more popular or happier. And instead, you lean into what it means to be a part of this resurrection. You enjoy it. We were given the Sabbath precisely because it's hard to believe the good news while you're still living in the bad news. So we had to see it with our own eyes. This is a gift. Don't ever hear yourself say, I have to go to church. I get to worship. I get to sit at the Lord's table. I get to receive from Him. And listen, if that's not where your heart is this morning, I'm not telling you to fake it. I'm telling you to turn toward the Lord and say, my heart is not there. Help me. Help me see that you've given me this rest. There's a hymn at the end of our service that we're going to sing, and we've been really kind of pushing it on you. 2 weeks in a row. This is going to be the third week. A love that will not let me go. It's written by George Matheson. A friend of mine's really into hymns. Everybody should have a friend like this who tells you what the hymns are, who the people are that did them. Well, he's got like hundreds of hymnals. He's constantly posting online about things he discovered in a hymnal, like two people care, right? George Matheson tells a story about George Matheson. George Matheson, when he was in seminary, he started to go blind. And then he went fully blind, and his fiancée left him because she didn't want to be married to a blind man. And his sister moved in with him, and his sister helped to take care of him. She took care of the stuff around the house, all the things you would need to do. And he wrote the song, "O Love That Will Not Let Me Go," on the night before her wedding. And she was about to get married, and she was going to move out. And he felt a great sadness and darkness pass between him and the Lord. Because he'd lost his vision, and he'd lost his fiancée, and now he'd lost his sister. But when you read the song, and, we're going to do it with jangly guitars and the whole thing, right? But when you hear it, the focus is not on saying, hey, look, when God shuts a door, he's going to open a window. It's not saying, just think about the good things. As a matter of fact, it drives us deeply into the story of death and resurrection in Christ. And it says that what you really need to know most, what you really need to understand is that his confidence, George's confidence was not that his conditions will improve, but that he was able to look at the past and see that Christ himself had suffered and was raised on his behalf. And I love this, that the language of the hymn is, "O love that will not let me go," just like a blind man would write it. Not, "O love that I can run after and find and observe and see," but "O love that will not let me go." A love that will grab hold of me. That's what Jesus does in the resurrection. He grabs hold of human flesh. He does not let it go until he redeems it. And what George knew was that that's what he needed to understand. And that in the balance, the best was yet to come. You and I have to know that. But we will only get there if we are willing to embrace the bad news of the cross to also receive the good news.